Beginning with this lecture, we're going to embark for a while on an exploration, another exercise in text crawling through Machiavelli's work, The Discourses on Livy. And while for many of you, I think, probably at least the outlines of what I said in the Prince will be pretty familiar to you, and therefore it's sort of an enhanced review, perhaps, for many of you who read the Prince somewhere along the way in his or her life, this, I think, for most people is going to be a new and interesting and hopefully a really intellectually exciting experience to get to know another side of Machiavelli, another kind of analysis that Machiavelli provides for us. And, as I've suggested already, ultimately, I want to make the case that when you really step back far enough, Machiavelli is one of the important Republican thinkers in the Western political tradition. While Machiavelli wrote The Prince in a matter of a few months, he took several years to write the Discourses, perhaps starting it while he was still writing The Prince, perhaps starting it afterwards. We really aren't sure. But it took Machiavelli a few years to compose this work. At the beginning of the work, Machiavelli makes very clear exactly what this work is for his readers. He refers to it as a book that contains as much as I know and as much as I have learned of worldly affairs through long experience and continuous study. So he recognizes the centrality of this book in conveying his thought. And I think it is interesting that he says specifically the two sources are study and experience. After all, he spent from 1498 to 1512, 14 years, as an official of a republic, and he has obviously read and reread and even chatted with, if you recall some of the phrases that that Machiavelli uses, he's chatted with Livy. He says that in his letter to Vettori, that I chat with the classics and they respond to me in their humanity. So this is a book that really Machiavelli has pondered and thought about in connection with his 14 years of service in a republic. And I think we're going to see that the results are really quite exhilarating intellectually for us. He begins by saying, here's a problem. People talk about the ancient world all the time. This is, after all, the Renaissance. That is to say, the educational plan of the humanist is a study of the classics. People are, in the circles Machiavelli hangs out in, constantly talking about the ancient world, he says. In fact, people are almost sort of crazed for the classics. He says, for example, people spend a lot of money to obtain a fragment of an ancient statue. They just love to have some ancient foot or ancient hand or ancient head or whatever it might be. He says, and also, in addition to wanting some physical thing from the ancient world, people admire the ancient kingdoms and republics of the past. They're constantly invoking the Greeks and the Romans and occasionally the Etruscans or the Egyptians. Obviously, they're invoking both the Hebrews and the early Christians. People are constantly doing that. However, the people who do all the talk, and in the case of buying fragments, do the buying, don't really try to imitate the people they admire so much. There's a disconnect from their admiration and the way they live their lives or try to shape their societies. It's as if these are two separate activities. Here I am participating in the affairs of state. Here I am reading a book about ancient Rome or ancient Greece. And Machiavelli basically says a lot of people make that disconnect. And that bothers him a great deal. There are a couple reasons for this, Machiavelli says. Number one, people don't really understand what the ancient historians say. They, sort of read the ancient historians lightly. They read it for entertainment. They read it for narrative. They read it for dramatic effect. But that's not enough, Machiavelli says, because the ancient historians are not entertainers. They're not there to provide some sort of diversion from the active life that you live. These men, historians, were engaged, and they believed that what they narrated, what they talked about, what they analyzed, had real value in the world. And therefore, if you read these classics lightly, if you read them for fun, you're not going to understand what they say. The second problem is that you say to yourself, well, those guys really had it good back then, but circumstances are so different now from back then, from ancient Athens or ancient Rome or ancient Sparta or wherever, that there's no way that we can learn anything about them that we can apply to ourselves. The gap is just too great in circumstances. And one of the things that Machiavelli will come back to again and again and again in this book and in his other books as well is what I would call the creative use of the past. You've got to do your homework. You've got to read the ancients seriously. And then you don't just say, well, they did X, I'll do X. You've got to work and say, how can I creatively apply the lessons of the past to situations that the writers about the past didn't know about and never anticipated? So that the reading of history is both an intellectual process in terms of making sure you know what these folks are really saying, and it's also a creative process. And my sense is that this lesson of Machiavelli, right at the beginning, as part of the explanation for why he's doing such a book, is a very important lesson for us today, because I believe so many people today do exactly the same thing. Either history is simply entertainment. I teach courses in the Middle Ages, and I'll have people who really just want to know about, what kind of hats did people wear, or how much did the armor weigh, or whatever. All that stuff has a certain kind of interest, and that's fine, but there are no lessons to be learned that we can apply to the present from that sort of curiosity about some of the exterior elements of the past. And there are those who say, well, you're teaching the Middle Ages. It's so different than the modern world. They sort of think dragons were running around, or that everybody thought dragons were running around. I can't learn anything from that world. And I think that if you take those principles, history either is simply entertainment or it is so distant and remote that it's not applicable, then we're going to end up, and perhaps some people are this way today, in a kind of presentism that gives us that sort of collective amnesia that the ignorance of history or the inability to apply history gives to society in general. So I want to emphasize, I guess this is the bias of a historian, that the comments Machiavelli makes about the uses of history and what you have to do to make history useful are very, very important, and I think right on target to us today. After that introduction, Machiavelli then begins, in many ways, this book parallel to the way he began The Prince. Remember, The Prince began with a kind of catalog, a kind of taxonomy of various sorts of government. You've got republics and principalities. I'm going to talk about principalities. There are these kinds of principalities, and he sort of catalogs them all and focuses on new principalities. Well, in the Discourses on Livy, Machiavelli says, let's talk about the different kinds of republics that exist. Okay? Here's where we start. Some republics were formed when people who are scattered decided to live together in a place because it was convenient and defensible. Okay? He gives examples of that. Athens. Of course, Athens' history is steeped in a lot of myth, and although Machiavelli knew that much of that history was mythical, nevertheless he draws on it because myth is very valuable as part of the historical understanding also. The modern example, well, modern in quotation marks, I guess we would say, is Venice. After all, the way we understand Venice is it didn't exist in the ancient world, unlike almost every other city in Italy. But rather, what happened was, toward the end of the empire, people headed out toward the swamps and the lagoons because they were places that were more defensible against the Germanic invaders than in the mainland. And so Venice formed as a kind of refuge from the invading Germanic barbarians toward the end of the Roman Empire. So sometimes people simply say, we need to form a society, not just a physical place, but a society, and let's get together and work together and live together in a place that is defensible and in a place that's convenient. The second kind of republic is created when Cities are built by foreigners. Foreigners come in and conquer someplace and say, we've got to plant a place that's going to be a center of our activity, whatever it might be. The chief ancient example that Machiavelli gives is Alexandria, the city in Egypt that, of course, was built from scratch by Alexander the Great. This was a great Greek city of Egypt because, after all, Alexander was bringing Greek rule to this very, very old nation in the 4th century BC. The example that he gives from Italy is his own hometown, Florence, because Florence began, as did many of the cities around it, I might add, as a Roman military colony. That, remember, the expansion through what we would call all of Italy was very gradual for the Roman Republic, and they would build cities, and they would build them to be sort of miniature Romes. They would have a forum, for example. The forum in Florence is today the Piazza della Repubblica, because it's been remodeled many, many times. There are no ancient monuments left on that piazza. But that's how Florence was founded. So he goes right back and talks about the origins of cities, the origins of societies, the origins in particular of republics. A second point that Machiavelli makes that I think really is important, and one we sort of know but don't think about as much, is the importance of geography in the foundation and development of societies. Again, let's just take Machiavelli's Italy as a way of looking at this. Florence is a city on a river, inland. It is very different than its neighbor to the south, Siena, which is a city on top of a hill. And both of those are very different than, say, Venice, which is a city that is on the sea and depends on the sea. Because for many, many centuries, Venice was really only the lagoons, and therefore they couldn't feed themselves, and therefore they depended on trade for their basic livelihood. And the point Machiavelli's making is an important one. Those places are going to be different kinds of societies. They're going to have, we would say today, different economies. They're going to have somewhat different social structures. They're going to be different places. And if we look at Florence and Siena, because they're neighbors, they're next to each other, and they fought each other for centuries. In fact, one could argue they still fight each other. When Siena last year beat Florence in soccer, in Major League Soccer, it was their first victory over Florence in something like 80 years. The whole city went gaga in celebration that they beat the damned Florentines. So these are different places, but their geographical settings dictates there are going to be differences. Obviously, there are many similarities. Florence was a republic, Venice was a republic, Siena was a republic. But they were very different kinds of places because, again, they're going to generate different economies, different social structures, and ultimately different political institutions. There is no perfect republic. There is no model that's translatable. Again, this is part of the larger theme that we've seen in The Prince, that you can't just Xerox a success story and put it in your world, because your world's not the same as where that success story came from. It's about understanding that sort of intellectual flexibility, that recognition that people do and must respond to specific circumstances which have never been quite that set of circumstances before, although, at the same time, there are lessons to learn from the past to guide them. Again, even talking about geography, we see this sort of mental agility that Machiavelli talks about that requires creativity and also requires study. Machiavelli, of course, starts off the Discourses, as you would expect, since it's about the Roman Republic, with a developed idea of what a republic is. Now, we talked about that a little bit in the last lecture. I gave you the basic definition of a republic that Machiavelli is going to use: a mixed constitution with elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Why do we need a mixed constitution? Well, monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy all can be good. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with them except for the fact that none of them is stable. On the other hand, the degeneration of those three forms of government, that is to say, tyranny from monarchy, government by the few but not the best, which is the degeneration of aristocracy, and mob rule, which is the degeneration of democracy. All of those are intrinsically bad. And therefore, Machiavelli is going to focus his concern on this mixed constitution. Now, I'm going to make this point several times as we journey through the discourses, but let me begin to make it now. One of the things that Machiavelli does in discussion of classic republics is to praise the constitution of Sparta. Because as he read Greek history, Sparta had a mixed constitution. That is to say, there was a king, actually there were two kings, there was a kind of senate, and then there was time when there was an assembly. And so as he reads the Spartan constitution, it was a mixed form of government, not as good as Rome's. In fact, Rome is the greatest of all the republics for Machiavelli, but nevertheless, Sparta is to be admired. Now, it's easy to look at that and say, oh, well, that's what you expect of that damn Machiavelli. You know, the guy liked princes and sort of tough guys and military, and that's what Sparta was. No wonder he liked. Everybody preferred Sparta to Athens in Machiavelli's day. In fact, we have to realize that the notion of sort of glorifying the Athenian constitution and Athenian democracy is really a product of the 19th century. That it's only then that Athens became, if you will, the model and the fair-haired child of the ancient world. We need to remember, for example, that our own forefathers in the United States were very careful not to follow the Athenian model of democracy. In the famous 10th Federalist paper that James Madison wrote, he rejects Athenian-style government and says it cannot work, and we sure as hell didn't want to do that. Those are my words, not James Madison's. But it's very clear that Machiavelli here is not saying anything extraordinary. That there was a general sense that Sparta, after all, was stable, that it was able to defend itself. We never want to forget what it's so easy to forget today, and that is in the great war between Athens and Sparta, Sparta won. Okay, the score in big wars between Athens and Sparta is Sparta 1, Athens 0. In 404, at the end of the Peloponnesian War, Athens surrendered unconditionally to Sparta. And we know that stability is something Machiavelli especially respects in such an unstable Italy that he lives in, where individual states change constitutions and states come in and out of existence or in and out of dominance, as we've seen in some of the historical background we've looked at with regard to Machiavelli. So we should not be surprised, as we sometimes are, that a great political thinker will look back on the ancient Greeks and say, I prefer Sparta. The Athenians didn't have a very effective constitution. That again seems odd to us. It made perfect sense, not just to Machiavelli, but to Machiavelli's contemporaries, to many before Machiavelli, and to many afterwards, really into the 19th century. Now, one of the most important points that Machiavelli makes toward the beginning of the Discourses is republics don't come into being all at once. They don't sort of pop up out of nothing. Nobody sits down and says, let's design a republic starting from scratch. After all, it is a mixture and a balance between different elements, elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And what Machiavelli wants to provide is a kind of evolutionary model for the emergence of republican government. He starts with the expulsion of the kings of Rome. Rome was ruled, at least as Livy lays it out, for about 250 years by kings. It was a monarchy. And then the kings were expelled. The last king, Tarquin, was expelled by Brutus. We've talked about him before. We'll talk about him more. So what happens at the expulsion of the monarchy? What happens is elements of monarchy are allowed to remain. People recognize there's value in having somebody in charge. But they don't want another king. They've had kings. They don't like kings. And so they created the office of consul. And they did two things to make it different from kingship. Number one, it was a one-year job. And number two, there were two consuls at the same time. And many of you who know anything about Roman Republican history know that dual consulate is an institution that survived for the entire history of the Republic. And so here is a modified monarchical element, and in this constitution that comes out of the expulsion of the last king, there is also a kind of council of the aristocracy. We call this the Senate. And again, when we think of the Roman Senate, we shouldn't think of it as being exactly like or even much like our United States Senate. Although the Senate of the United States, as it was originally created, without direct election, is more like the Roman Senate than what we have today with popularly elected senators. Nevertheless, that's what emerged, an institution that was part monarchy and part aristocracy. Only later did, in fact, there come to be enough unrest among the common people that they were granted their own officials called tribunes as a way of participating in the decision-making process of the Republic. And only with the emergence of the office of tribune, Machiavelli says, reading Livy, do we really have a Roman Republic, a full-blown republic with elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, therefore evolved. It evolved out of monarchy, and it further evolved out of a combination of elements of monarchy and aristocracy. And so we need to look at the development of republics as organic, not as being handed down from on high in any way. Now, the next point Machiavelli makes is one where he, again, as I've said in earlier lectures, directly is in opposition to classical writers like Cicero. Cicero had a view of government that said, what we need is to not have any strife, not have any conflict. We all need to get along. We all need to have the same picture of reality. There shouldn't be struggles. There shouldn't be parties. There shouldn't be factions. There shouldn't be any of those things. Okay, we need to all get along and put all that stuff aside. Machiavelli says, my word, not his, hogwash. Republic emerge out of discord. Discord is good sometimes, not always, but discord is good, and without discord, there would have been no full-blown republic developing. It's when the common people sort of rose up and said, we want to play too. It was that conflict between the aristocracy and the common people that ended up with the establishment of the office of tribunes and giving people a voice in the government of ancient Rome that really completed the Roman Republican Constitution. That's a very important point. I want to read you a passage from the Discourses where Machiavelli says this directly. I must say that it appears to me that those who condemn the disturbances between the nobles and the plebeians condemn those very things that were the primary cause of Roman liberty, and that they give more consideration to the noises and cries arising from such disturbances than to the good effects they produced. Nor do they consider that in every republic there are two different tendencies, that of the people and that of the upper class, and that all of the laws which are passed in favor of liberty are born from the rift between the two. If we take a look at the Roman Republic and say, what do we value in the Roman Republic? We realize that what we value most didn't come from everybody holding hands and singing Kumbaya. They came from the disturbances and struggles that existed. Those were creative tensions, we might say today, in the Roman Republic. Not all tensions are creative, but in the Roman Republic, those tensions evolved into exactly what Machiavelli would define as the best constitution, practically, that's ever been. So, first of all forms of government are represented. The one by the consuls, the few by the Senate, and the many by the tribunes. Secondly, I want you to listen to another word that I read to you in that passage from Machiavelli. The laws in Rome that really provide for the liberty, there's the word, liberty of the people, are laws that come out of conflict. It is in the struggle and the negotiation and the compromise and sometimes the physical disturbances and the speeches and all the rest of it. Machiavelli wants to be very, very clear about this, that he objects to, he rejects the notion that Cicero has, that republics, whenever they are strong arguments, whenever there are clashes, whenever there are factions, that inevitably that's a bad thing. Maybe, may not be a bad thing. It depends. Now, interestingly, Machiavelli switches to the present and say, well, we have a lot of conflict in Florence. But Machiavelli says the conflicts in Florence have by and large been destructive. They need not have been. The problem is not the conflict. The problem is how Florence has dealt with conflict, very often through mass exiles. After all, in the Discourses later on, Machiavelli mentions the fact that Dante was exiled from Florence. He talks about it in the Florentine histories that we're going to look at a little bit later on. So Florence has handled conflict in a way that has been destructive, but it need not be destructive. The issue is not condemning conflict. The issue is condemning the wrong use of conflict. I want you to notice how this parallels with things that we learned in The Prince. That is to say, he talks about cruelties that end up well and cruelties that end up badly. He talks about times when it's good to tell the truth and when it's not good to tell the truth. The issue, Machiavelli always says, is results-oriented. Does conflict, does disturbance always lead to something bad? No. Sometimes it does, but it certainly didn't in the time of the Roman Republic. In the early Republic, it was conflict that produced the Constitution that we all praise. You can't praise the the Roman Constitution and condemn all struggle, all faction, all discord, because without the discord, there would have been no Roman Constitution. Same kind of argument that Machiavelli makes with regard to Hannibal. People praise Hannibal for the discipline of his army, but reject the very cause of that discipline, which was his cruelty. So Machiavelli is using the same kind of thinking here. And what he's doing is reminding us that it's sort of silly and not useful to stand up and say, somebody can never lie. We should never have conflict. What we have to do is look and see how those situations work and how they evolve into either something good or something evil. And we've got to look at the way people respond to them rather than condemn them for their own sake. That certainly is Machiavelli's argument. He goes on to say, with regard to liberty, that the desires of free people are not harmful to liberty. That people speak out, people make demands. That's okay, that's a good thing. He also, and this may not sound like the Machiavelli of the Prince to us, people, he said, can grasp the truth and they can recognize it. Machiavelli has a lot of trust in the collective understanding of people. I mean, we all know, you know, if you walk along the street and just chat with, a random number of people, you're going to find some people you say, gosh, totally irrational, totally this, totally that. But Machiavelli says the people as people, and this is especially true, we're going to learn later on, when the laws are good, when regulations work well, when there's a strong government, you can trust people. You can trust the people collectively. And then Machiavelli turns to a particular kind of republic. He says there are republics that nevertheless put more power in the hands of the nobles, if we use the Roman model, let's say in the hands of the Senate, than in the hands of the common people. And let me examine that, Machiavelli says. Sparta, for example, did not allow foreigners access to government, restrictive. Venice did not arm the common people. Rome did allow foreigners access to government and did arm the common people. Again, Sparta and Venice are real and important and in many ways good republics, but Rome was right. It was an inclusive republic. You allowed more people in and you didn't fear the common people or their judgment so much that you wouldn't arm them. So although Venice lasted a long time, although Sparta lasted a long time, Machiavelli says the Roman model of inclusion of foreigners and the arming of the common people is the best model of republic that has ever been.